I just finished playing Persona, as you can probably tell from my drawn and somewhat haggard expression. That was a bit of a marathon. 110 hours. 110 hours. And that wasn't even on hard difficulty. Yeesh. The game's come in for a lot of praise and a lot of flack in kind of equal measure. And I guess it's kind of easy to see why that is. It's very much a very kind of old school style JRPG, uncompromising, long, very long, and it doesn't really, the localization is fairly minimal in that lots of Japanese cultural references and so on is left in. So it's very much a game for gamers, and in anime terms, I guess you could say it's a game for purists, the kind of people who prefer subtitles. And to me, these are all fairly good things. You know, when I play a Japanese game, I want to experience the culture of the people that produce the game. I want to experience their view of the world. I want to experience as close to the original experience as possible as you can get without actually learning Japanese, which would be a step too far. I know a little bit, enough to order whiskey. That's really all you need to get by. But otherwise, you know, that's why surely we take in culture from other cultures, you know, to learn and to understand, to find new things. And throughout playing Persona, I found myself looking things up on the laptop, not just to cheat and answer the questions in the tests that you get through the game. More on that in a sec. But just because I was interested in like the areas of the city and all these kind of references and cultural cues and so on, the kind of stuff that really got me into manga and anime and JRPGs in the first place. So yeah, it's kind of been peripheral to a lot of these arguments that have been going on about regionalization and localization and so on, and American and European localization groups taking fucking liberties when it comes to translating the material. I mean, it seems like a majority of gamers want the same thing that I want, this kind of pure experience, a translation, not a rewrite. I mean, to an extent, some things need to be done to tidy up the language and make it comprehensible in some ways, but there seems to be this trend of localizers going too far or injecting their own political, social or moral viewpoints on it. We particularly see this with sexual censorship of Japanese games of all kinds, and it's a real shame, I think, but Persona seems to have bucked that trend in a big way. Not only that, in terms of the localization and so on, but in terms of the whole style of the game, it's definitely a throwback to those traditional JRPGs. So in terms of game mechanics, what we're basically looking at is a kind of twisted teleportation accident between a dating simulator and sort of Final Fantasy VII era JRPGs. So the game is basically split into two parts, essentially. The part that takes place in the real world, in that you're this kind of delinquent student who is basically on probation, has been sent away to a different school in another place to try and kind of rebuild his life and get back on track. You know, you're staying with a guardian, you've got no friends and so on when you start out. And that part is all about exploring the city, the different regions and so on, getting engaged in social stuff and buffing your statistics. And the primary role of these statistics, which is things like kindness, charm and so on, is that as those rise, it unlocks more conversations, more people to talk to. The latter stages of a kind of closeness indicator that you have with various characters depend on you having higher statistics. So that's important. the other main part is this social aspect. So you're building relationships, not as you would in a dating sim in the hopes of seeing some hentai on your monitor, but in hopes of getting boosts to your abilities when it comes down to combat and stuff, which occurs in the other world, which we'll get to in a moment. It also opens up new stuff you can do with your friends and so on. It opens up new ways to boost your statistics more. So there's a kind of interlaced web of ways to build relationships and boost your character, and this is accomplished by spending time doing it. This was actually quite a frustrating element of the game. It never seemed like there was enough time to really do anything. You're under a constant time pressure, which is good for making you feel like, you know, you're up against something and you're working towards a goal and so on. But it was frustrating because there's just not ever enough time in the day, which is understandable, but I think it went a bit too far with that, especially since you keep getting bombarded and interrupted by certain events, or people you've built relationships up with will call you and want to hang out, and obviously you want to boost those relationships, so you do that. And then there's all these other things you can do, like you can go to the cinema, you can watch DVDs, you can play games. These things all boost your stats. You can read books, you can study, you can go to the batting cages, all this other stuff that you can do. Go on dates once you've got a high enough alignment with someone that you like, and it's best waifu, fight me in real life. So yeah, that's kind of the real world stuff. Occasionally there's some other bits and pieces to move the story forward and so on, but that's the real world side of the game. And then you get into this whole otherworld stuff. So the whole conceit of the game, and what makes it something more than a tame dating simulator, is this other world. And this other world is a cognitive world. It's the collective unconscious made flesh, and you and certain other characters around you gain the ability to transfer themselves into this cognitive world and to gain all kinds of miraculous special abilities and so on while they're in there. Your appearance changes, you can summon all kinds of weird forces and stuff, spring around, see hidden treasures, all this kind of stuff kind of emerges out of that. And in this world there are also shadows, so there are sort of monstrous creatures that come up, all kinds of allusions to various forms of psychology and so on going on. And there's been previous investigation into this called cognitive science, which various people are trying to use and manipulate to control people's minds and desires. You are trying to change people who are bad. So you're going into this cognitive world to change the way that they think and to change the way that they act by dicking with their brains in this other world, which is obviously morally and ethically somewhat dubious, but the people you pick on are dicks. There's no way of escaping from that. So when someone has this kind of twisted desire and so on, they create a mind palace around themselves, which is this kind of distorted picture of the world and how they see themselves. And so to change their minds, you basically have to access these thematic dungeons, work your way through them, solve puzzles, defeat monsters and so on, and then steal a treasure at the end. And when you steal the treasure, that's what changes their mind, and then things over in the real world change. So, like, you could find a murderer who had this distorted perception, and then you'd go into this other world, fight your way into their brain, steal their treasure, emerge out to the real world. They would suddenly get attacked by guilt and remorse and bad feelings and confess their crimes and end up in prison, and hooray, you've saved the day. Mechanically, for all that, after all that preamble, you're basically looking at a standard JRPG. So what you're looking at is monsters with various strengths and weaknesses and all kinds of different elemental attacks and so on you have to balance. You have a party, it's turn-based, very much like the old Final Fantasy VII. So, you have to judge, am I going to heal, am I going to attack, what attack am I going to do, have I run into this creature beforehand? And your powers stem from a sort of thing, a power that's bound to you. So your companions, that's static. For you, you can take monsters that you've beaten and bind them to yourself and use their powers, and you combine them to create new powers and all this kind of stuff. But basically it's just take your turn, attack, they attack back. Occasionally you'll defend yourself, use items. You know how it goes, really. Style-wise, it's a very stylish game with all of the design and everything. The anime sequences, the intro sequence and everything are all really good, top-notch, very striking. I don't know that they needed to use the CryEngine particularly, but they did. Some of the animations are a bit stilted and shonky. The voice acting is okay. So yeah, it looks nice. Story-wise, right? You know how we often take ideas and concepts and folkloric figures and monsters and stuff from other cultures and we use them in our games, not necessarily in the way that you might expect. It's always interesting in Japanese media to see them do that with Western culture, so Western religion and creatures and so on, and then turn it around and use it in a kind of mirror image way. It doesn't insult or bother me at all, but I just find it very interesting, especially as an atheist, to see Christian iconography and ideas and so on turned around and used as monsters quite often. You often see that in manga, you often see that in anime, and you often see it in games just like this one, and this one's no different. So I always find that endlessly fascinating. Thematically, it's really a story about rebellion versus order, which has been a pretty popular theme in games everywhere, really. I mean, it's the central theme of Assassin's Creed as well. That whole chaos and freedom versus order and imprisonment, basically, is the same themes you find here. And you're playing rebels, and this is an incident in which, incidents in which Japanese culture and so on works against it, because Japanese culture being, relatively speaking, more straight-laced and disciplined and so on, the rebellious kids that are in your party and include you, to Western eyes, don't seem particularly rebellious or outstanding or strong-willed or anything. Only the character of Ryuji, who is basically a useless dickhead most of the time, is one heroic moment. He's the only one that really feels like a rebel to Western eyes. The rest of them don't. But that's a cultural thing, and that's an interesting aspect of the game. It's just it's a slight hurdle that you have to overcome to really get into it. And the overarching plot is also rooted in Japanese cultural issues. You know, youth versus the aged, the aging population, and so on and so forth. There's kind of grey sameness of their politicians. Yeah, all of these kind of things are part of the background. And the more you know about Japanese culture, the more you know about Japanese society, the more you'll get out of the game. And so the game encourages you to learn about these things in a kind of passive way, which again I think is good. It's very long. Did I mention it's very long? 110 hours. It's quite a long game. That's good in terms of value for money, but parts of it do become rather repetitive, particularly the theme music. I found the theme music really repetitive. It started making my eyes twitch by the end. There's also a sub game in the secondary world, the shadow world, the cognitive world, where you delve into this semi-random dungeon, but it's really just corridors and rooms and the occasional monster wandering around, and it's really quite dull. Layer by layer of the dungeon, the scenery changes slightly, the monsters get slightly more powerful. That's about it. So that was incredibly boring, but necessary for grinding for money and experience and items and materials and so on. But it was tedious. I wish there'd been a bit more variety in that. But the main dungeons, the palaces that the baddies have, those are all interesting, sometimes funny, sometimes creepy. There's at least 2 penis monsters in the game, so look out for that. But the length helps it, because it does give it enough room and enough space and enough time, if you put the effort in, for you to get to know not only the characters in your party, but the people outside your party that you form relationships with. And so you do genuinely start to feel a bond with these characters, even though it's quite railroady and none of your decisions make any particular difference. You do still end up, just by virtue of the amount of time invested in it, getting connections with these characters. Even the cutesy cat character, and I've never been a fan of Snarf from Thundercats. I think those kind of characters are unnecessary, but in this you couldn't help getting a bit attached to Mona even. So is it worth getting? On value for money terms, absolutely. I mean, we're talking pence per hour of entertainment. You know, compare that to going to a cinema or something. And it is kind of like playing through an anime serial, especially with the anime cutscenes that are in it. So you can't fault it on that. Now, I give scores on style and substance and overall, and each of those is rated from 1 to 5. So style-wise, I would give it a 4. The character designs and everything are all great. The anime sequences are great. The palaces that the enemies are in are great. Monsters, good design. That's all good. I can't fault it on any of that. Why I don't give it a 5 is because some of the motions of the characters and so on, the attacks and specials and so on, are really a bit wooden. Not particularly well done, shall we say. And you always feel slightly off from the world that you're inhabiting. It's particularly noticeable in the real world, like you're kind of slightly moonwalking or whatever. So a little bit more polish on the animations and so on would have gone a long way to making the game seem less stiff. And it does make these segue between the CGI sequences and the anime sequences rather jarring, because you go from a rather wooden and robotic character to a full, properly expressive and moving animation, and it's a bit, it just throws you a little bit. So I'm not sure, not too sold on that. So I'm going to knock it off a point for that. Substance-wise, like I say, you can't fault it on the amount of game that you're getting for your money. But I can't give it the full 5 because the area called Mementos, this sort of grinding dungeon, is thoroughly tedious. And that's the kind of main detraction from it, I guess.
Thank you very much.
The rumors.
It could have been a little tighter. It's a bit flabby here and there, but still, just considering the sheer weight of the game, I'm going to give it a 4 for substance as well. So that's style 4, substance 4. Add those together, average them out for an overall score of 4, which is pretty damn good. I don't give those out that often. So yeah, I reckon it's worth getting, even if you want to wait and get it out of the bargain bin once some other people have finished sinking all of their time into it. But it's a good game. Zang.